What if I told you that the smartest, like the most structurally sound decision you could possibly make to build a $1 billion company is to look at a resume from a seasoned, highly decorated senior software engineer at Google, throw it in the trash, and instead hire an 18-year-old high school student from Sweden?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd.
Right. But today, we're looking at why almost everything you've been taught about hiring, managing, and scaling an organization is, well, fundamentally and structurally wrong.
It is entirely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Because when we normally talk about startups or honestly any successful business, we lean on this super comforting romantic myth.
The lone genius in the garage.
Exactly. You picture the lone genius. You imagine a couple of kids in a dimly lit garage in Silicon Valley, hunched over a soldering iron. And then suddenly there's this eureka moment.
A flash of light.
Right, a flash of lightning. They write a brilliant algorithm on a whiteboard. The product ships. And overnight, they're billionaires. Like, the story makes it seem like the survival of a company depends entirely on the magic of the idea itself.
Yeah, it makes the whole process seem clean. Like it's just binary. You either have the $1 million idea or you don't. And if you do, the rest is just, an inevitable victory lap.
And we really crave that narrative. We like things to be visible, to be categorized into these neat little Hollywood arcs of invention. But the reality is a brutal wake-up call.
Oh, absolutely.
When you step into the actual grueling world of building a company from the ground up, that beautiful myth just shatters instantly. The landscape you are actually navigating is far more mechanical, it's fragile, it's deeply messy.
So the idea isn't the main thing.
Not at all. The survival of a company doesn't depend on the magic idea. It depends on the invisible, structural forces of human organization. I mean, it is the absolute definition of an organizational crucible. The idea is maybe 1% of the equation.
And the other 99%.
The other 99% is a high-tension, high-stakes game of human capital, psychology, and structural engineering.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive, because we are dissecting a massive, highly coveted stack of masterclass lectures given by some of the most successful founders in the history of tech.
Some incredible source material here.
Yeah, we are pulling directly from the playbooks of the founders of Stripe, Pinterest, Airbnb, and the core partners at Y Combinator. So our goal today is to provide a high-tension analytical breakdown of the structural forces of hiring, the architecture of company culture, and the incredibly delicate mechanics of employee retention as a company scales from 2 people in a room to 1,000 people across the globe.
And as you listen to this, I really want you to actively apply these mechanics to your own life. Because, whether you are managing a small retail team or trying to build the next massive software startup or just trying to navigate the complex, often frustrating dynamics of your corporate department, understanding these underlying psychological forces is a masterclass in how human groups function under extreme pressure.
Because humans are the one constant, right?
Exactly. They are the one variable in business that never changes. The technology evolves, the markets shift, but the human animal under pressure reacts the exact same way today as it did 50 years ago.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the absolute foundation, the crucible of the first 10 hires. Because there is a foundational premise that came out of the lecture with the founders of Stripe, Patrick and John Collison, and the founder of Pinterest, Ben Silbermann.
This is such a crucial concept.
Right, and the premise is this. When you hire your first 10 employees, you aren't actually just hiring 10 people. You are, in reality, hiring your first 100 people.
Yeah, it is a profound mathematical reality of human networks, and founders miss it constantly. Every single person you bring into that initial core group of 10 is going to eventually bring 10 more people with them as the company scales.
They hire their friends. They hire people like them.
Exactly. They're going to attract people who are exactly like them. It is a genetic founder effect. Think about it. A players hire A players, but B players hire C players because they are threatened by people smarter than them.
Oh, that's so true.
So if you compromise on hire number 4, like if you bring in someone who is maybe technically proficient but a little arrogant or slightly politically motivated or lazy, you haven't just made one bad hire.
You've infected the whole pool.
You have essentially pre-hired 10 future toxic employees who will permanently infect your company's DNA.
You're planting a seed that is going to grow into a massive thorny weed that could strangle the entire organization before it even gets off the ground. And this is where we get into the strategy of what the Stripe founders call value investing in humans.
Right, like Warren Buffett.
Exactly like Warren Buffett. Because let's paint the picture of what you are actually dealing with in the early days. When you are a tiny startup, No one knows who you are. You have a terrible office. You are probably working out of a cramped apartment. You absolutely cannot pay market salary, and your equity is essentially monopoly money.
Right. It has a 99% chance of being worth absolutely zero.
Exactly. So if we look at the mechanics of the labor market, established tech giants like Google or Apple have perfectly priced the market for obvious talent, right?
Precisely. If a software engineer has a Stanford computer science degree and 5 years of flawless experience at a major tech firm, their market value is established. It's visible to everyone, and it's incredibly high.
So you can't buy them.
You, as a startup founder with no money, cannot compete in an efficient market.
Right.
If you try to bid for that Stanford engineer,
Yeah.
you will lose every single time. So you have to find the inefficiencies. You have to seek out human capital that is significantly undervalued by the broader market.
And the examples they gave from Stripe's early days are just mind-blowing. Like, they didn't even attempt to go after the seasoned Silicon Valley veterans. They hired their very first designer when he was literally an 18-year-old high school student living in Sweden.
It's wild.
And their chief technology officer was a college student. These were people whose raw talent was massive, but whose resume value was essentially zero to the rest of the corporate world.
It requires relaxing your constraints in a very specific strategic way. Like, you absolutely never relax your requirement for raw aptitude. You never compromise on how smart, adaptable, or dedicated they are.
But you compromise on the polish.
Exactly. You completely, entirely relax the requirement that their talent is apparent to anyone else. You ignore the lack of degrees. You ignore the lack of pedigree. You ignore the lack of corporate polish. Startups at the early stage are ugly ducklings.
They have to find other ugly ducklings.
Yes, who secretly have the genetic makeup of a swan. You are looking for the brilliant misfit that the rigid corporate machines don't know how to categorize.
Which brings us to Pinterest. Because Ben Silbermann talked extensively about what he looked for in those early days, and he specifically said he looked for people who were quirky, people with a borderline insane dedication to their side projects.
Borderline insane is the perfect way to put it.
Right. He hired one engineer who had spent countless completely uncompensated hours inventing and building a wildly elaborate physical board game with its own massive, dense rule book.
Which is just a crazy thing to do for fun.
And he hired another guy who had built an incredibly simple magic trick app for the iPhone, but had gone to the tremendous trouble of shooting this high-production cinematic video just to show off this tiny, meaningless trick.
That is the exact signal you're looking for. You're looking for an obsession with the details that borders on the pathological, because you cannot train that into someone. The Collison brothers noted this exact same phenomenon at Stripe. They looked for people who felt actual physical pain when a product was even slightly off.
Physical pain, like it hurt their stomach.
Literally. If a pixel was out of place on a screen or a line of code was inefficient but still technically worked, it shouldn't just annoy them. It should deeply physically bother them in their gut until they fix it. It has to keep them awake at night.
But, okay, I have to push back here. Because this sounds incredibly romantic in hindsight. But practically speaking, let's say you are sitting in a room with a candidate. How do you actually screen for quirky or insanely dedicated or physically pained by bad pixels in a standard 45-minute interview?
It's really hard.
It sounds like trying to judge if you want to marry someone based on a 3-minute speed date. Like, you sit across the table, ask them what their greatest weakness is. They give you a practiced answer about working too hard, and you're supposed to divine their deepest psychological traits from that.
You're exactly right to challenge that, because the answer the founders give is a complete structural teardown of the hiring process. You don't use traditional interviews.
At all.
At all. A traditional interview is nothing more than a performance. Anyone moderately smart can fake culture fit and extreme dedication for 45 minutes. You have to break the interview structure entirely. The Stripe method in the early days was radical. They would fly the candidate out and actually sit down and write code with them over an entire weekend.
Oh, wow.
Or, better yet, they would have them come work with the team for a full, grueling week before either side committed to the hire.
A whole week? Just pausing your life to go work for a tiny startup for 7 days as a test?
A whole week. And the psychology behind this is bulletproof. It is psychologically impossible to fake who you really are for an entire week of 12-hour days under high stress. In a 45-minute interview, you can hold your breath. For a week, you have to breathe.
Right, the mask slips.
If someone is secretly arrogant, or if they don't actually care about the tiny details, or if they secretly despise collaboration, that mask will inevitably slip by day 3. You are putting them into the crucible, turning up the heat, and simply watching how the metal reacts. Does it hold its shape or does it melt?
And speaking of the heat, this applies even more intensely to the very first people in the room, the co-founders themselves. Sam Altman, in his YC lecture, lays down a very strict, almost uncompromising rule for this. He says you should never, ever choose a co-founder that you haven't already known for years.
It's the classic mistake.
Yeah, the classic mistake in Silicon Valley is going to a networking event, meeting someone who seems smart, thinking they have a complementary skill set, like, oh, marketing and I know code, and deciding to start a company with them the next week.
It's the exact equivalent of marrying someone you met at a bar last Tuesday simply because they also like dogs and happen to have a good credit score.
Right.
It's structural suicide. The tension of building a startup is going to crack any relationship that doesn't have a deep pre-existing foundation of trust and shared history. When the bank account is empty, when the product launches and nobody cares, when the investors are screaming at you, if you don't have years of established trust to fall back on, you will turn on each other.
The friction just destroys the machine from the inside out. Altman actually goes even further into the psychology of the co-founder. He says you need to look for a very specific trait, something he calls the James Bond trait.
I love this concept.
It's so good. You need someone who is entirely unflappable. Think about the movies. When the servers crash, when the biggest investor pulls their term sheet at the last second, when a major publication runs a hit piece on you right now, you need the person who calmly straightens their tie, looks at the ticking bomb with 10 seconds left on the timer, and systematically figures out which wire to cut.
You need tough, decisive action. You cannot have someone whose nervous system defaults to panic.
So if we step back and look at what we've just discussed, you can start to see the terrifying, beautiful machine they are building. You have a James Bond co-founder who doesn't panic. You have 10 18-year-old Swedish designers and magic trick app developers who feel actual physical pain over bad pixels and obsess over board game rules.
It's a very specific room of people.
You have assembled a team of highly specific, intense, borderline obsessive individuals. They are raw, uncut diamonds. Which brings up a terrifying new problem. Once you actually have a room full of intensely obsessive, quirky, brilliant people, how do you get them to row in the exact same direction without killing each other?
Because that level of passion is explosive.
Right. If everyone is obsessing over different details, you have chaos. And that leads us directly to the architecture of culture.
And culture is perhaps the most misunderstood and bastardized word in the modern business lexicon.
Oh, absolutely. When people hear company culture, especially in tech, they immediately picture the superficial trappings. They picture ping pong tables in the break room, free kombucha on tap, beanbag chairs, and maybe bring your dog to work Fridays.
Which is just HR marketing.
Right. But the founders in these lectures are incredibly clear, almost aggressive about this. Culture isn't a perk. Culture is the operating system of the company. It is the black box. As Alfred Lin from Sequoia Capital, who is absolutely pivotal in building the legendary culture at Zappos, points out, culture and brand are actually just two sides of the exact same coin.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that black box, because it's crucial. Lin argues that if you view your company as an equation, the inputs are your capital and your talent. The outputs are your revenue, your product, and your customer satisfaction. The culture is the black box in the middle that processes those inputs into those outputs.
So if the box is broken,
If the black box is fundamentally broken, it doesn't matter how good your inputs are. The smartest, most well-funded engineers in the world will produce a terrible product if they don't trust each other, if they prioritize internal politics over user experience, or if they are afraid to take risks.
that makes perfect sense.
And Lin is adamant about the timeline of this investment. Culture does not pay off in the short term. It is a massive structural drag on your immediate efficiency.
He actually says something shocking about that timeline. He says if your goal is to build a company quickly, inflate the metrics, and sell it to a bigger competitor in 1 year for a quick profit, his best advice is screw up the culture. Just ignore it entirely.
Ignore it.
Hire as fast as humanly possible, lower your standards, throw warm bodies at every problem, burn people out, and sprint to the finish line before the whole thing collapses. Because building a real, enduring culture requires hiring painfully, excruciatingly slowly.
It is an active constraint on your early growth, and it requires immense discipline from the founder. Like, look at Brian Chesky at Airbnb. This is a legendary story. He spent 5 whole months searching for their very first engineer.
5 months for one person.
He looked through thousands of resumes and personally interviewed hundreds of people. For 5 months, the company was essentially stalled. They could have been building features, acquiring users, generating revenue, but they sat still because they absolutely refused to compromise on the cultural DNA of employee number one.
Because of the founder effect.
They understood the founder effect. If employee number one is slightly off, employee number 10 will be terrible.
Chesky's interview tactics during those 5 months were wild, too. He used to sit across from these highly sought-after engineering candidates and ask them, with complete sincerity, if you knew you only had 10 years left to live, would you still take this job?
And you really have to understand the intense psychology behind that question. Most people would hear that and run for the door.
Oh, I would be terrified.
Right. But Chesky wasn't looking for a casual employee. He wasn't looking for someone who just wanted a paycheck and health insurance. He was demanding that they bleed Airbnb. He wanted people who viewed the mission of human connection and belonging as their literal life's work. He wanted zealots.
Now, he eventually realized that asking someone to dedicate their final 10 years on Earth to a startup was a bit too intense, and he changed it to a different metric. But the underlying intensity, that demand for absolute mission alignment, remained.
The culture acts as a filtration system. It repels the mercenaries and attracts the missionaries.
But culture isn't just about who you hire, it's also a mechanism for execution. It dictates how the company actually moves through the physical world. Let's look at Ben Silbermann again in the very early days of Pinterest.
Oh, this is a great story.
Nobody understood what Pinterest was. It was a joke to the tech elite. The prevailing wisdom was that social networks were about text and status updates, not pinning pictures of wedding dresses and recipes. Silbermann couldn't buy Facebook ads because they had no money, and even if they did, the conversion rate would have been zero.
So what did he do?
He literally ran around coffee shops in Palo Alto, physically tapping strangers on the shoulder, interrupting their day, and begging them to try his app on his laptop.
And he took it even further than that, embedding a level of hustle that is just hard to comprehend.
He did. He used to sprint into the Apple store in Palo Alto. He would evade the employees, go to every single display Mac, open the Safari browser, and quickly change all the default homepages to Pinterest.com before the Apple employees caught him and physically threw him out of the store.
That's hilarious.
So when random customers walked in off the street to test out a new computer, the very first thing that popped up on the screen was Pinterest.
Now let's break down why this matters structurally. This is the perfect embodiment of Y Combinator founder Paul Graham's famous advice: do things that don't scale.
Right, because changing browsers isn't a scalable strategy.
Obviously not. You cannot get 10 million users by getting kicked out of Apple stores. But doing it embeds a vital loop into the company's culture, creates mythology. Imagine you are an employee hired 3 years later. You are sitting at a nice desk with a good salary, and you hear the story of the CEO risking arrest to get 5 users. What do they do to your psychology?
It completely resets your baseline for acceptable effort.
Exactly. When someone asks you to do manual QA testing on a weekend, you can't say, well, that's beneath me, because, the founder used to get thrown out of malls for this company. The unscalable stunts become the folklore that guides future behavior.
It prevents a very specific fatal flaw that plagues a lot of startups. In the YC lectures, they point out that startups born out of elite institutions like Stanford often fail constantly for one very specific reason.
And what's that?
The founders are too eager to be executives. The minute they get $1 million in funding, they immediately want to play corporate dress-up. They hire a VP of sales, they hire a customer support team, and they sit in a glass office looking at dashboards and spreadsheets, pretending they are running a Fortune 500 company.
And that completely insulates the founders from the messy reality of their own product. The structural rule here is that the founders must feel the physical pain of bad customer support themselves. You cannot outsource the pain.
Sam Altman noted that the most successful founders physically hooked up PagerDuty alerts to their customer ticketing systems.
Think about the mechanics of that. If a user in London emails at 3 a.m. because the app crashed and they lost their data, the founder's phone next to their bed starts screaming. They have to wake up, open their laptop, find the bug, and fix the code themselves.
That's brutal.
It is, but that structural physical pain guarantees that the product improves rapidly, because the founder literally cannot sleep until it does. If you outsource that pain to a $15 an hour support rep in another country, the rep doesn't have the power to fix the code, and the founder doesn't feel the pain. The product stays broken.
That is such a visceral, aggressive way to build a company. And to protect that intensity, Companies like Airbnb literally weaponized their core values. They didn't just print them on a poster, they built them into the organizational chart. They created a role entirely dedicated to this, the core value interviewers.
The mechanics of the core value interviewer are brilliant because they solve a massive conflict of interest in the hiring process.
Right. Imagine you are a senior engineer applying to Airbnb. You will have a grueling technical interview. You will stand at a whiteboard and write complex algorithms for hours to prove you are technically brilliant. But you will also be interviewed by someone completely different.
Like a marketing manager.
Exactly. You might be interviewed by a marketing manager or a customer service lead who has zero engineering background. And the catch is, they are legally not allowed to ask you a single technical question. Their only job is to figure out if you actually champion the mission. Are you hospitable? Do you genuinely care about the host community? Do you bleed the values?
And if they say no,
If that core value interviewer says no, it doesn't matter if you are the best coder on planet Earth. It doesn't matter if the VP of engineering is begging to hire you. You do not get the job. The core value interviewer holds absolute veto power.
it structurally segregates the evaluation of skill from the evaluation of alignment. Why is this necessary? Because human nature is weak. It is incredibly tempting for an engineering manager who is desperate to ship a product, who is behind deadline, to look at a candidate who writes beautiful Python code and say, look, I know he's arrogant, I know he doesn't care about our mission, but we really need this code written. Let's just hire him.
Yeah, you compromise for the short-term win.
By separating the powers, the culture is protected structurally against the short-term desperation of middle management. The core value interviewer doesn't care about the engineering deadline. They only care about the culture.
So we have this intense, carefully curated group of people. But here's the critical pivot. When you are 10 people or 20 people, this all happens naturally. You are physically in the same room. You share the same pizzas. You can look across the table and see if someone is bleeding the mission. But as you scale, what happens when you go from 10 people to 50 people? From 50 to 170 people?
That oral tradition completely shatters.
You can't just absorb the culture by sitting next to the founder anymore because the founder's in meetings all day.
The intimacy breaks. You have to write the laws down. The unwritten rules of the tribe around the campfire have to become the codified constitution of a nation-state. And that transition, moving from implicit culture to explicit structure, introduces an incredible amount of friction. Which brings us to the complex, highly controversial mechanics of radical transparency.
This is a fascinating structural tension because right around that 25 to 50 employee mark, there is a fundamental scaling breakpoint. The flat structure, where everyone just taps the founder on the shoulder to ask a question, physically breaks. There aren't enough hours in the day for the founder to make every decision.
And as Sam Altman points out, this is the exact moment the founder's job fundamentally shifts. They have to stop building a great product, and they have to start building a great company. The company itself becomes the product they are engineering.
And to manage that massive growth without losing the blistering speed of a startup, companies like Stripe leaned heavily into radical transparency. To understand why this is radical, you have to look at the traditional corporate model. Traditional corporations operate on information asymmetry. Only the executives know the strategic roadmap. Only the directors know the budgets.
And the rank-and-file employees operate on a strict need-to-know basis. They are treated like cogs in a machine. Stripe inverted this entirely. They decided that asymmetry slows you down.
The mechanisms they used were incredible. They used a tool called HackPad, which is basically like Google Docs, but with a public newsfeed attached to it. Essentially, every single document created in the entire company was public to every single employee.
Wow, everything.
Everything. Even wilder than that, they had an email rule. If you had a meeting with more than 2 people anywhere in Stripe, you were required to take notes and send those notes to a company-wide email alias. Meaning, if you were a 22-year-old new hire who started yesterday, you could literally open your email and read the raw, unfiltered strategic debates the founders had over coffee that morning.
Let's explore the structural logic here, because it solves one of the oldest problems in economics. The principal agent problem. The principal agent problem occurs when the person making the decisions, the agent or the manager, has different priorities than the owner, the principal. The manager might want a bigger budget to inflate their own ego, while the company needs to cut costs.
That makes a lot of sense.
By making absolutely all information transparent, Stripe ensured that every single person was rowing in the same direction, with the exact same map. Transparency forgives a lot of organizational breaks. If a manager makes a weird decision, the employee isn't left in the dark wondering if it's malice or incompetence. They can just go read the meeting notes and see the exact constraints the manager was working under. It builds immense trust.
But wait, I have to stop you here and put myself in the shoes of an employee. If I am working at Stripe and I know that every single document I write, every single half-baked brainstorm, every rough draft is instantly visible to 170 incredibly brilliant, highly critical people, doesn't that just paralyze you?
You'd be terrified.
I would have massive stage fright. I would be terrified to pitch any new idea unless it was polished to absolute perfection, which means I would spend weeks on it, which kills the very speed you're trying to protect.
That is the exact paradox of transparency. And you've hit the nail on the head. The Stripe founders explicitly acknowledged it. They literally coined it, the stage fright phenomenon. When everything is public, it introduces the danger of drive-by criticism.
Like someone just casually ruining your day.
Yeah. Imagine you are a junior engineer and you post a very early, messy outline of a new feature. And suddenly someone from the marketing team who doesn't understand engineering constraints casually drops a brutal comment on the document saying, "This looks terrible." They don't realize it's just a rough draft.
Which would make that junior engineer never, ever want to share a rough draft again. They would hide their work until it was perfect. The transparency would ironically cause extreme secrecy.
Exactly. But the structural fix for this isn't to retreat. It isn't to hide the information and go back to silos. The fix is to develop rigid, almost dogmatic cultural norms around how internal information is treated and critiqued. You have to actively train your workforce on the etiquette of transparency.
So you need rules of engagement.
You have to establish and enforce rules like, do not critique a document labeled draft for formatting, or always assume positive intent. Or if you were going to criticize an early idea, you must offer an alternative. The transparency only works if the culture of feedback is highly disciplined. It is a dual system, open information, but strict rules of engagement.
It's like building a company out of glass. It's beautiful, the light gets everywhere, everyone can see the horizon, but you have to intensely teach everyone inside to stop throwing stones or the whole thing shatters.
A perfect analogy. And some founders tried to push this glass house concept to its absolute extreme limits, far beyond just meeting notes. Keith Rabois, in his lecture on operations, talked about the ultimate taboo in corporate transparency, the third rail of business.
Compensation.
He told the story of Steve Jobs experimenting with completely transparent compensation during his time running NXT after he was ousted from Apple.
Transparent compensation, meaning everyone knows exactly what everyone else makes, down to the dollar. Just thinking about that makes my palms sweat.
It's terrifying for most people.
That is the ultimate corporate heresy. We are trained from birth, from our very first jobs, that you never, ever discuss your salary with your coworkers. It is considered rude, dangerous, and a fireable offense in some places.
But Rabois challenges us to question this deeply held assumption. Why is it a heresy? Why is transparent compensation considered a toxic taboo in the business world? But it is the absolute, unquestioned standard in professional sport.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Think about it. In the NBA, the NFL, or global soccer, every single player knows down to the penny what their teammates make. LeBron James knows exactly what the rookie sitting on the bench makes, and the rookie knows exactly how many millions LeBron makes. It is completely public knowledge.
And it doesn't destroy the team.
Yet, they still step onto the court, they collaborate perfectly, they pass the ball, they sacrifice their bodies for each other, and they win championships. The transparency doesn't destroy the team. It establishes a clear, undeniable meritocracy.
That is a fascinating parallel to draw, but there is a massive difference in the mechanics. In sports, the statistics are public and objective. If LeBron makes $50 million, the rookie can look at his points per game, his assists, his championship rings, and say, yep, the math adds up, he generates the wins.
Right, it's undeniable.
But in a corporation, performance is wildly subjective. If I find out that Bob in accounting makes 20% more than me, I don't have Bob's public stats to look at. I don't see his accounting points per game. I just assume the boss likes him more, and I feel incredibly resentful.
Which is precisely why Rabois argues that if you want to attempt transparent compensation, you cannot just rip the Band-Aid off. You must simultaneously implement perfectly transparent, highly objective performance metrics.
Yeah.
If you cannot quantitatively prove to the entire company exactly why Bob is more valuable than you, the transparency will trigger a mutiny.
So you have to be flawless as a manager?
It forces the management team to be flawlessly objective. It removes their ability to play favorites. If you can't measure it, you can't make it transparent.
And speaking of compensation tearing a company apart, this transitions us perfectly into one of the most fraught areas of building a company. Because when you mix company culture with personal finance and ego, things become incredibly emotional, incredibly fast. How does a rapidly scaling company handle the mechanics of retention, raises, and equity without exploding from the inside out?
This is where we get into the deep psychology of management. And nobody articulates this better than Ben Horowitz. He is an absolute master at breaking down the agonizing, hidden micro-decisions of leadership that founders face every single day.
His breakdown of the shmoney dance raise dilemma is an all-time great business lesson. It is a scenario every manager will face. Okay, let's paint the picture for you. Imagine you are a startup CEO. You have an employee. Let's call her Sarah.
Okay, Sarah.
Sarah is a fantastic engineer. She works hard. She delivers her code on time. She is a cultural pillar who helps onboard new hires. One day, Sarah walks into your office, closes the door, and says, "Listen, I love it here, but I have been doing great work, and I just got an offer from a direct competitor. I want to stay, but I need a $20,000 raise to make the math work."
And as the CEO sitting across from her, your immediate, overwhelming psychological instinct is to just say yes. You are terrified of losing your best talent. You want to be the good guy. You know that if you give Sarah the raise, she is going to be thrilled. She's going to walk back to her desk doing the shmoney dance celebration. The immediate crisis is averted, morale is saved, and everyone is happy. It feels like the right move.
But Horowitz drops the hammer here. He says the critical management concept that amateur founders fail to grasp is this: you cannot view a decision through the eyes of the person sitting across from you. You must view the decision through the eyes of the entire company.
Because there are no secrets in a startup. None. Word will always get out. And you have to imagine another employee. Let's call him David. David sits 3 desks down from Sarah. David works just as hard as Sarah, maybe even harder. His code has fewer bugs. His output is actually slightly better.
But David is quiet.
But David's personality is different. He is introverted. He deeply dislikes confrontation and office politics, so he hasn't marched into your office threatening to quit and demanding a raise. He just puts his head down and works, trusting the system to reward him.
So what happens when David inevitably finds out that Sarah got a $20,000 bump just for walking into your office and asking?
It completely destroys David's trust in you and in the entire organization. He realizes in a flash that in your company, actual performance does not dictate reward. Aggression dictates reward. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, while the silent engine goes unrewarded.
That's devastating for David.
So David is left with 2 terrible choices. He either has to adopt a toxic, demanding, political personality that goes completely against his nature, or he has to quit and go to a company that actually tracks and rewards merit. By giving Sarah an off-cycle raise to save the moment and feel like a good boss, you have structurally punished your quietest, hardest working employees. You have created systemic rot to achieve a localized win.
It's devastating when you look at it that way. And the solution Horowitz offers is almost physically painful for startup founders to hear because founders hate corporate rules. But Horowitz says that to save your organic, free-flowing, meritocratic culture, well, you actually have to implement rigid, boring corporate bureaucracy.
You have to build a formal process and stick to it like religion. You have to look Sarah in the eye and say, I value you immensely, but we only do compensation reviews every 6 months. I will evaluate you and everyone else during that cycle. I cannot give you an off-cycle raise.
Which feels awful in the moment.
It feels incredibly rigid. It feels cold. Sarah might even quit. But that rigidity is the only structural armor that protects the broader culture from becoming a political bazaar where the loudest, most aggressive people export the most money from the company. Process protects fairness.
Which brings us to the most high-tension structural debate in this entire deep dive, the options clash. The debate between the 90-day window and the 10-year window. This is where Sam Altman and Ben Horowitz fundamentally, aggressively disagree, and it is a fascinating look at the ethics versus the cold mechanics of building a company.
Let's lay out the mechanics of how startup stock options work for you, the listener, so the stakes are clear. When you join a startup as an early employee, you are granted stock options. These options vest over time, usually over a 4-year period. This means you earn them slowly.
Right.
If you leave the company after 2 years, you have officially earned half of your options. But here is the massive catch. Under standard Silicon Valley legal rules, once you quit or are fired, you only have 90 days to exercise, which means to actually purchase those options.
And buying those options requires cold, hard cash. You have to buy the shares at the strike price. And worse, if the company has grown in valuation since you joined, you owe taxes on the theoretical gain. The tax bill alone on those paper options could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that a standard 26-year-old software engineer simply does not have sitting in a checking account.
Exactly. So if an employee wants to leave, maybe they are completely burnt out from working 80-hour weeks. Maybe they want to start their own company. Maybe they just want to spend time with their family. They're trapped.
They can't afford to leave.
If they leave, they can't afford the massive tax bill within 90 days. So they are forced to forfeit the equity they bled for over the last 2 years. They are held hostage by the 90-day window. Sam Altman wrote a fiery, highly publicized blog post arguing that this is fundamentally unethical. He advocates that companies should extend this exercise window to 10 years. Let the employee leave, let them keep their hard-earned options, let the company eventually go public or get sold, and then the employee can exercise the options when they actually have the liquid cash from the sale.
And honestly, looking at it from the employee's perspective, I am completely on Altman's side. It sounds incredibly humane. If I worked those 80-hour weeks, I helped build the foundation of the company. I earned that equity. Why should I be punished with a massive tax bill just because I need to move on? It feels like a trap designed by venture capitalists to keep labor cheap and compliant.
It absolutely feels that way, and Altman's argument is very compelling. But Ben Horowitz steps into the ring and plays devil's advocate, and he brings the cold, unforgiving math of the cap table. The capitalization table is essentially a ledger of who owns what percentage of the company.
Right. Think of the cap table like a pizza. There are only 8 slices. You can't magically bake more slices without making everyone else's slice smaller. Every time you hire a new executive, you have to preface them a bite of that pizza.
Exactly. The pizza is finite. So Horowitz looks at the 10-year window from the perspective of the employees who choose to stay. If an employee decides to leave after 2 years to go take a cushy, high-paying job at Facebook, and you let them keep their options locked in for 10 years, they're taking up dead space on your cap table.
Because they still own that slice.
That is a bite of the pizza that you now cannot give to the crucial new engineer you have to hire to replace them. You are starving the company of the equity it needs to attract future talent.
And it gets so much worse when you consider the psychology of the loyalists. Think about the engineers who stay. They are grinding it out for year 3, year 4, year 5. They are fighting the existential battles. They are working weekends to fix server crashes. And they look at the cap table and realize that the guy who bailed 3 years ago to go work a 9 to 5 at a massive corporation is going to get the exact same financial reward as they are, but he took 0 of the ongoing risk.
Extending the window to 10 years structurally punishes the loyalists. It rewards people for leaving early and penalizes the people carrying the company across the finish line. Horowitz argues that the 90-day rule isn't a malicious trap designed to hold people hostage. It is a vital structural necessity. It ensures that the finite resource of equity is concentrated strictly in the hands of the people who are currently bleeding for the mission. If you leave the battlefield, you leave the spoils.
It's a brilliant, agonizing debate. Both sides are completely right. You have the ethical human desire to not hold your employees hostage, warring directly against the structural necessity of rewarding long-term loyalty and preserving your equity pool for future hires. It really forces a founder to ask a defining question. Who are you building the company for? The people who helped start it or the people who are going to finish it?
And that tension reaches its absolute peak when we move to the final phase of organizational scaling, because it is one thing to debate how to retain a good employee who wants to leave or how to handle their options. It's an entirely different, much darker, much more emotionally devastating problem when you have to deal with a beloved senior executive who is failing. This brings us to high-tension breakdowns, barrels, ammunition, and firings.
Let's go back to Ben Horowitz for this, because he outlines a scenario that every single manager in any growing company has faced or will face. You have an executive. Let's say he is your VP of sales. He was one of your first 20 hires. He is incredibly loyal. He knows everyone's name. He works from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. every single day. The entire office loves him. But the company has scaled.
Right. Things changed.
You've grown from 50 people with a single product to 500 people with a complex global enterprise suite. And this VP is completely hopelessly in over his head. The skill set required to manage a scrappy 5-person sales team is fundamentally different from the skill set required to manage a 100-person global sales force with complex compensation structures. He's failing, and the sales numbers are missing targets.
So as the CEO, you are faced with a terrible choice. Do you fire this beloved, hardworking loyalist who helped build the company? The emotional pain of doing that is immense. You feel like a traitor.
Yeah.
So the CEO's brain, desperate to avoid the pain of firing a friend, invents a compromise. The graceful
I
demotion.
feel like graceful demotion.
You think, I'll just hire a new, highly experienced senior VP of sales from Oracle to go above him, and I'll demote our original guy to a regional director role. He gets to stay at the company, he keeps his salary, we get the expertise we need. It's a win-win.
It sounds like the perfect human compromise. You save your friend and you save the company. But Horowitz absolutely shreds this idea. He says it is a toxic illusion that will poison the company.
Let's break down the structural fallout of the graceful demotion step by step. First, look at the equity pizza we just talked about. This original VP of sales was an early hire. He likely holds 1.5% of the entire company. Now he's been demoted to a mid-level role. Look at your brilliant junior engineers. Look at the people who are currently working 80 hours a week, driving the actual success of your new product, who maybe own 0.1% of the company.
They're going to be furious.
How do they feel knowing that a demoted, failing middle manager owns 15 times more of the company than they do, simply because he was hired 3 years earlier?
It sends a devastating message to the entire organization. It tells everyone that actual results don't matter. Only tenure and effort protect top-tier equity. You are telling your rising stars that it doesn't matter how brilliant they are, they will never ever catch up to the guy who failed but stuck around. It kills meritocracy instantly.
And the fallout doesn't stop with the engineers. What about the people who used to report to this demoted VP? In the corporate hierarchy, once you have been publicly declared incompetent at the top level, you lose the invisible aura of authority. When he tries to give orders as a regional director, his subordinates won't say it to his face, but they will whisper, "Why should I listen to your strategy? You're the guy who couldn't handle the big job."
He loses all respect.
He becomes a ghost, haunting his own department, a walking reminder of the company's past.
It's brutal. It's so emotionally difficult to accept, but it leads to the ultimate necessary conclusion. Firing fast, while emotionally agonizing and awkward, is structurally vital. As the sign in that YC Partners interviewing room famously said, mediocre engineers do not build great companies. You cannot compromise the machine to save one person's feelings. You have to cut the cord, give them an incredibly generous severance package to honor their early contributions, and protect the structural integrity of the organization.
Which forces us to look at the other end of the spectrum. If you must be ruthless about firing the mediocre, how do you identify and elevate the truly exceptional? How do you know who is actually driving the company forward?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Keith Rabois introduced a concept in his lecture that completely changed how I look at the workforce. He divides all employees into two distinct categories: barrels and ammunition.
It is a brilliant, slightly militaristic, but highly accurate metaphor for human capital. Let's define ammunition. Ammunition refers to people who are incredibly smart, hardworking, capable, and dedicated. But they need a target. If you point them at a very specific, well-defined problem, and say, write this specific code to solve this specific database issue, they will execute it flawlessly. But if you give them a vague objective, if you say, we need to improve user retention in Europe, they freeze. They don't know where to start. They are high-velocity projectiles, but they have no internal guidance system.
And then you have the barrels. A barrel is a rare type of person who can take a vague, chaotic idea from inception, scope it out, build the framework, execute it, ship it, and most importantly, bring other people along with them. They are the structural casing that directs the explosive energy of the ammunition.
Rabois argues that you can hire all the brilliant ammunition in the world, but your company's velocity is strictly limited by the number of barrels you have. If you have 50 brilliant engineers but only one barrel to organize and direct them, you will only ship one product at a time. The other 49 engineers will just sit around waiting for orders.
The million-dollar question, of course, is how do you spot a barrel before they have the official title of manager? How do you find them when they are just a junior employee? Rabois gives a brilliantly simple sociological test that you can run in your own office tomorrow.
I love this test.
If you have an open plan office, just stand up from your desk and watch the physical movement of your employees. Literally watch the foot traffic. Watch who goes to whose desk. If you consistently see engineers, designers, and marketers walking over to the desk of a specific employee that they do not officially report to, asking for help, advice, or direction on a project, well, you have found a barrel.
The informal org chart. It's the natural hierarchy of competence revealing itself in real time. Because people naturally gravitate toward the person who actually knows how to get things done, regardless of what the official corporate directory says. Robois says when you see that happen, when you see people flocking to a junior employee's desk, you immediately promote that person. You give them maximum responsibility because the organization has already subconsciously decided that they are a leader. You just have to make it official.
But identifying barrels, firing failing executives, implementing rigid compensation cycles, all of this requires something incredibly difficult from the founder. It requires immense psychological fortitude. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, talks in his lecture about the maddening paradoxes a founder must constantly navigate.
It's an impossible job.
You have to be relentlessly persistent on your long-term vision, but infinitely flexible on your short-term tactics. You have to believe with absolute certainty that you are right when the entire world says you are wrong, but you also have to be paranoid and humble enough to listen to valid criticism from your customers.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. And Ben Horowitz sums it up perfectly by saying that a CEO's #1 job, above raising millions of dollars, above hiring the best talent, above designing a beautiful product, is managing their own psychology. Because being a founder is a completely unnatural state of being. You are constantly absorbing the terror of failure, the pressure of making payroll so your employees can feed their families, and the massive emotional weight of everyone's expectations. Your brain is constantly looking for an escape hatch from the pressure.
And if we extrapolate this to the broader company, a profound truth emerges. Almost every structural failure in a company is actually just a physical manifestation of the founder's internal psychological failure. Let's look at matrix management. This is when an employee reports to multiple bosses. Maybe they report to a product manager and an engineering manager. It creates endless confusion and gridlock.
Why do companies implement it? Because the founder was psychologically avoiding the conflict of picking a definitive leader, retaining a toxic high performer who destroys morale. That's a founder prioritizing short-term metrics over long-term cultural health because they're terrified of missing a quarterly revenue goal, ignoring HR processes. That's a founder hiding from the messy, uncomfortable reality of human emotions. A company's structural flaws are almost always a mirror reflecting the founder's internal avoidance of discomfort.
So what does this all mean for you? Let's zoom out and synthesize this incredible journey we've just been on. We started in that mythical garage with the romantic idea of the lone genius writing code on a whiteboard. But what these masterclasses from the architects of Stripe, Pinterest, Airbnb, and Y Combinator have showed us is that building a successful company isn't about magical ideas. Ideas are cheap. Building a company is about the cold, hard, often painful mechanics of human organization.
It is about planting the right genetic seeds with your first 10 undervalued, borderline obsessive hires, knowing they will dictate the next 100. It is about recognizing that culture isn't a perk, but a long-term filtration system that requires founders to do unscalable things and feel the physical pain of their own product. It is about having the courage to write the rigid laws of radical transparency so the machine doesn't tear itself apart with paranoia when it scales. And it is about navigating the psychological minefields of raises, cap tables, and the devastating, unavoidable necessity of firing the very people who helped you build the company.
It is an engine made of flesh and blood, and it requires a mechanic who is willing to get their hands dirty in the deep psychology of the people running it.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go back to your own teams. We spend so much time in business obsessing over how to attract the absolute best talent. We write endless think pieces about perks and compensation structures and visionary leadership to lure top performers. But consider this. What if the true, undeniable test of your organization's culture isn't how it trains its absolute best employee, but the exact manner in which it handles the departure of its worst? Because every single person in your company is watching the exit door just as closely as they are watching the entrance.
Wow, that is a heavy, essential question to ask yourself. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Look at your own office tomorrow morning. Look at who is walking to whose desk. Ask yourself the hard questions. Are you just collecting ammunition? Or are you building barrels?